Have you ever stopped and reflected on some of the conversations that you might have with people that you bump into while you're out fishing? The other day I was coming off the water. We'd had a successful day, caught a few mangrove jack out on Trinity Inlet here in Cairns, my local waterway. And look, it's the dry season, the water temperatures are down, and definitely the jacks weren't as aggressive and weren't as playful as what they are during the warmer months, but we encountered enough jacks to keep us happy and keep us wanting to be out on the water. And all in all, it was a pretty good day out. Anyway, as we were coming in, I bumped into this gentleman and we had a bit of a chat, and he said, I never bother fishing Trinity Inlet anymore. It just gets so much pressure. There's people out there all the time. The jacks are scared of lures, so I don't bother going after them. And I thought, well, that's an interesting perspective, but we're talking about Cairns here. Population, 150,000 people. Trinity Inlet is a very large mangrove wetland. There's plenty of fish in it. On top of that, the inlet is one of a number of net-free zones in Queensland, so there's been plenty of opportunity for fish to spawn and recruit into that system, and in my view, the fishing's pretty good. And I didn't say it out loud, but I guess inwardly I was thinking, dude, maybe you need to go and fish Port Phillip Bay or Moreton Bay or Sydney Harbour or Botany Bay or somewhere like that for a little while and understand what real fishing pressure's about. But I get it, we base our beliefs on our experiences. I suspect this gentleman had lived in Cairns all his life and he's seen the fishing pressure increase over the years, but he didn't have the perspective of fishing in some genuinely heavy pressured systems around Australia. But the other thing that occurred to me as I was talking to this gentleman was that we're probably a little bit spoiled in this part of the world, as many Australians are, I guess. We don't have to go too far north or south to find systems that are slightly less pressured, don't have a major regional centre on their shores. And perhaps in those systems, the fish are either less smart or less spooky, whatever the case may be, and more willing to take lures. And that's nice. I mean, who doesn't like being spoiled, really? But being spoiled also tends to make us a little bit lazy. And as I chatted with this bloke, I realised that there was a little bit of that kind of creeping in. I was talking to him about lure choices and different things he might do on the inlet because the fish do see a few more lures and do hear a few more boats. And he kind of said, he kind of brushed it off and said, well, I'd rather just go north or south, find a system that's a bit quieter and continue doing what I do. And that's fine too. That's his choice. And we've got the luxury of doing that. But for me, Trinity Inlet is only 15 minutes away, which is the same for pretty much everyone in Cairns, to be honest. And so the ability to zap down there and put in an hour or two without having to take a whole day out. I can do it during school hours. I can do it during the evening after dinner. I can get up early in the morning and put some time in on the inlet, which you can't do if you're driving an hour north or south. So even though there are easier fisheries further away, it's the convenience and the accessibility then that makes it such a valuable resource for me. And I guess the other thing is, if you can catch fish in a pressured system, you can definitely catch fish in a less pressured system. So it makes me a better angler to spend time fishing on Trinity Inlet. I'm talking about my local. You can apply what I'm saying here, of course, to your local, wherever that may be, and whatever species of fish it is that you might be targeting. Now, sometimes when I fish on this, and I'm doing air quotes at the moment, pressured system, unquote, sometimes when I fish on this pressured system, I get a little bit lazy myself and I might slip into, without thinking about it, using lures and techniques that work well on systems where fish are not so heavily pressured, but are not so effective on my local waterway. But when I'm on my game and I am fishing on a pressured system, I will do things a little bit differently. And I know most experienced anglers will do this, and it's probably something that less experienced anglers don't give a lot of thought to. So I thought I'd make that the topic of today's podcast episode. It's all about some techniques and some tactics for fishing on heavily pressured systems. So we better get some intro music going. I've been rambling on, haven't even started the podcast yet. Let's get the intro music out of the way and then we'll get into today's episode.
This is the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, where our mission is to help everyday sports fishers experience extraordinary lure fishing. If next level fishing is your dream, then let us provide the tools and information that will bring that dream to life. Tune in as our expert hosts chat with Australia's best anglers and share their tips for success. Then check out our website. It's one of Australia's largest and most popular online fishing resources. But right now, settle in to listen as ALF founder Greg "Doc Lures" Vinall delivers today's episode through the nerdy lens of a scientist, lure maker, and sport fishing tragic.
All right, well, here we are coming at the back of the intro music. So let's talk about some techniques and some tips for fishing on highly pressured systems. And like I said at the start, I don't consider my local to be highly pressured, but certainly it's more pressured than some of the other waterways around. But for those who live in major centres, the Melbournes, the Sydneys, Central Coast areas in New South Wales, Brisbane, Moreton Bay, Gold Coast, those sorts of areas, lots and lots of fishing pressure, lots of boating noise, lots of commotion, and that can make the fishing a little bit tougher. So these techniques will apply definitely to you. Now, if you're fishing in areas that don't see as much fishing pressure, don't see as many anglers, or maybe only see that level of fishing during the holiday periods, then a lot of this stuff still applies when you're having a quiet day. You hear people say, oh, the fish are shut down today. Well, I don't believe the fish are, this is my own theory, but I don't believe the fish are ever completely shut down. I reckon there's always a way, if you persist and if you are a thinking angler and you try different things, there's always a way to find fish. And sure, it can be tougher some days than others. Sure, all of us have donuts. Anyone who tells you they don't have donut days, well, they're either fibbing or they're fishing in a really easy place for really easy species, because donut days happen, right? There are days when the fish, just for whatever reason, not going to take lures. But I guess you give yourself the best chance of minimizing those donut days and minimizing the quiet times if you use some of these techniques, whether it's on highly pressured waters or just on a shutdown quiet day. So I'm going to go through 5 tips today in no particular order, but 5 different things you can do. And there's probably another dozen things as well, but 5 key things that you can do that will help you to improve your chances in heavily fished areas or on days when the fish are a little bit quiet. And I'm going to start by talking about leaders. Now, this is something that if you've listened back over the past 670 plus episodes of the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, you'll hear come up over and over again as I talk to our country's top anglers, that if the fishing's tough, downsize your leaders, downsize your lures, fish more slowly. Now, there are exceptions, and there are people who do things differently. That's par for the course. But as a general rule, the consensus across the majority of anglers is that these things can help you to catch fish in heavily fished waterways. And as a general rule, I'd probably agree that's been my experience as well. So lighter leaders generally help to improve your chances when you're fishing in heavily fished waters. Now, a lot of people believe that's because fish can see the leaders and they become leader shy. And there may well be some truth to that, but for me, I think the key factor with a lighter leader, there's a couple of things. One is it allows you to work your lure better. Your lure's going to have more action on the light leader. It's going to get dragged around less by currents. It's going to cast more accurately. It's going to get caught less by the wind and all those sorts of things. And it'll allow your lure to get a little bit deeper as well. So if you're using something like a diving lure, a floating minnow or a suspending jerkbait or something like that, whether you're casting it or trolling it, a lighter leader and a lighter line will allow that lure to get deeper because it's less drag pulling the lure upwards. So you get more action and you get greater depth with your lure. Now, fish in a pressured system, I think quite often are looking for a little bit of depth because it puts some distance between them and the commotion on the surface. It gives them that feeling of security to be in a little bit deeper water. Now, what does a lighter leader mean? Well, up here in the north, we might start at 50 pounds if we think there's a possibility of a barramundi jumping on board while we're targeting mangrove jack. But going down to 20 or even 15 pound leader isn't out of the question when I'm fishing on the inlet. At least if I'm specifically targeting jacks. We do get an occasional bycatch of barra, but it's not that common. If I was fishing somewhere where barra turned up more frequently, I'd probably be a little hesitant to go down to those leader strength. I'd probably stay a little bit higher just for the abrasion resistance. But once again, it's horses for courses. If you're fishing for bream in Sydney Harbour, that might mean going from a 4 pound leader down to a 3 pound or even a 2 pound leader. If you're fishing for trout in a heavily fished lake, then it might mean going from a 7 or 8 pound leader down to a 3 or 4 pound leader, something like that. So it just depends on where you're fishing and what you're fishing for. But dropping down a couple of sizes of leader can definitely make your lures work more effectively, get a little bit deeper, cast more accurately, and all those sorts of things. So never a bad thing to downsize your leader. You do risk losing big fish to abrasion or bite off or whatever. That's the chance you have to take sometimes to be able to get the bites. So that's leaders. It's a pretty obvious, pretty easy one. The next tip I have for you, tip number 2, is about just being a little bit more stealthy. And this is one of the areas where I see a lot of people who fish on my local don't kind of make this effort to just fish a little bit more stealthily and give themselves a better chance of getting near a fish that's not aware that you're there. Now, anytime a fish is aware of your presence, and fish have pretty amazing environmental awareness, right? They're going to detect you more often than not. They're going to know that you're there. But you'll see this quite often with less experienced or perhaps lazy anglers, that they don't make any real effort to be just that little bit quieter on a waterway where fish see a lot of lures and hear a lot of boats. And I guess one of the lessons that I learned early on in my fishing career is that just because fish are there and you can see that they're there, or they're either on your sounder or you can visibly see them in the water, doesn't necessarily mean that they're not aware of you. And I discovered this with big blue-nosed black bream down in Tasmania at a couple of spots that I used to fish there. And I would spend hours trying to catch these fish until I worked out they knew I was there. They hadn't run for cover, they hadn't hidden, they hadn't disappeared, but they also weren't feeding because they knew that I was there and they were on a state of heightened alert and heightened awareness. I guess for most anglers, I guess they consider when they're on the electric motor, then they're being stealthy. And if you go back years ago before electric motors, well, that's definitely the case, isn't it? An electric is a lot quieter than a petrol motor and a lot easier to perhaps get closer to fish without revealing your presence. But electric motors are a lot more commonplace these days, and they're not as quiet as you might think, particularly in a small waterway. Think about, I'll go back to my home waters fishing for mangrove jack on Trinity Inlet. Some of these creek systems, they're only a couple of boat lengths wide, right? So an electric motor in that environment, it's a fairly quiet environment, it can be quite loud. Now, when you get a good tidal run through there and you're running the electric at 5 or 6, 50 to 60% just to hold position in the current, that definitely makes quite a bit of noise, and the fish can definitely hear that. Ideally, I like to keep my electric motor down at speeds 3, 4 absolute maximum when I'm trying to be stealthy. And if it's practical, I'd rather drop down a plonk or an anchor on a chain that's covered with a tyre inner tube or something like that to keep the rattling and noise to a minimum, or even tie it to a tree if I'm going to stay in a fishing spot and make a number of casts. That's not usually practical for the style of fishing I do. It's kind of a run and gun fishing where you're firing 2 or 3 casts at each piece of structure as you drift or slowly motor along a river system. That doesn't work so well for that. But if I was going to be staying at a spot for 10 minutes or more and casting consistently at fish or at a particular piece of structure, or if I was positioning myself at the mouth of a creek for the turn of the tide or something like that, then I'd much rather be swinging off a plonk. For those who don't know what a plonk is, it's basically just a heavy weight anchor. And of course, that's cheap and easy to do. Or you can go the high-tech and much more expensive way and use a power pole or something like that to hold the boat in place. There's a reason why this type of equipment has been developed, right? Look at what goes on overseas in Florida and places like that. People fishing for snook, which are very similar to barramundi, by the way. There's a lot of concern about the noise of electric motors. There's a lot of people poling the flats. There's a lot of people using power poles and other technology to keep their fishing as quiet as possible. But I guess whatever your strategy, just understand that electric motors are not silent. They do actually spook fish, and fish are aware of your presence if you're spot locked on an electric motor. Remember also that when you come into a spot, even if you're coming in on the electric motor and you're still moving forwards, particularly in still water or something like that, you're still moving forwards and you hit that spot lock, the first thing that the electric motor does is spin around to counter the forward movement of the boat as you're gliding, spin around and ramp up to a fairly high speed to stop the boat in its tracks, and then it spins around a few times until it finds what the tide and what the wind are doing and positions the boat perfectly. But that high speed turning of the motor head and high speed spinning of the prop and high revolutions of the engine when you initially hit spot lock can be very jarring to fish. So best way is, if you can do it, it's not always possible depending on tides and winds and currents and all sorts of stuff, but the best way is to come in, slowly ramp down your electric motor speed until you're close to stopped and then hit spot lock. Not always possible, probably more possible on lakes and things than it is in river systems, but keep that in mind. And then the usual stuff like being really careful about moving quietly on your boat if you're on the boat, or moving quietly on the bank if you're on the bank, not dropping things on the ground, not dropping things on the boat or banging things against the hull, keeping music down, all those sorts of things to stay fairly quiet as you fish, and not a bad plan. So that's tip number 2. So we've got leaders, we've got stealth. Tip number 3 is about timing your fishing trips. And once again, I'm going to use my own backyard as an example here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Trinity Inlet. So one of the things that you'll find on the inlet is that it gets very busy on very pleasant days. And particularly if there's enough wind that people don't want to go offshore to go out to the reef, but it's sunny and it's not so windy in the inlet. And so you get a lot of boating traffic on those calm days. So timing your fishing trip around those busy periods can be a really good thing to do. So weekday fishing, if you can manage it, that's always a good thing. First thing in the morning, last thing in the afternoon when the boating traffic is a little bit quieter. So all the fair weather anglers who have come out without really too much of a clue, not too serious, they've all gone home and you've got the waterways to yourself a little bit more. Now, one of the things that I see people do a lot in this part of the world is that they'll go right up a creek system on the main motor, and often at fairly high speed. They'll get to as far up the creek system as they want to go, and then they'll turn around, drop the electric over the side and fish their way back down. So they've alerted every fish in the system as they've motored through, and then they're coming back to cast at fish that they've pre-warned about their presence. Now, I used to try and find systems in the inlet where there hadn't been too many boats come through. It's a pretty hard thing to do because it's a popular place to go crabbing. It's a popular place for the bait fishers. And so quite often those people will be putting in their pots late in the afternoon, pulling them out first thing in the morning so that they're not getting robbed by other people. There's a couple of professional crabbers that work the inlet as well. So the boating traffic, even in the quiet, small, shallow parts of the creeks, can be quite heavy. And it seems for some reason as though people who go crabbing either don't understand or aren't interested in fishing, because they'll go through these systems once again on the main motor at full speed. So I can be quietly, stealthily working my way along a river system on the electric motor, only to have someone come roaring past on a 4-stroke or, heaven forbid, even a 2-stroke, and giving me a friendly wave as they go past and spook every fish within hundreds of meters and just about throw me off the boat with their wake. But that's part and parcel of fishing in a heavily pressured system, and if you let it frustrate you, you'll stop fishing on that system. Yes, I'm always more confident if I'm on a system that hasn't had a boat go roaring through it. If I'm able to quietly work the system over before it sees any boating traffic, that's definitely ideal. But if you think about it, if that's happening day in, day out, fish have to get used to the fact that there are boats moving around. And I suspect that while it puts them down for 5 or 10 minutes, they probably come back to, back to feeding and back to life shortly afterwards, because they've got no choice. If they stop feeding for the entire day because a boat went through, they'd never feed, right? There's so many boats going through day after day. But there's no doubt that if you can find a quiet day, if you can find a system that hasn't had boating traffic, it's going to be a bit easier to tempt some fish. And ironically, in far north Queensland, one of the best times to fish in the estuaries for mangrove jack and barramundi is on those calm, glassy days when the majority of boat owners shoof out to the reef looking for reef species, and the estuaries are empty and they're glassy and there's no wind and they're easy to fish. An example that jumps to mind is a particular snag that's kind of right at the mouth of a small creek system that drains a wetland, mangrove wetland, and there's always jacks on this particular snag. And that's because there's always bait on this particular snag. But therein lies the problem, because if I can get to this snag, and usually I have to get there pre-dawn and put in a few casts, I'll nearly always catch a fish just on first light. But shortly after that, I know that somebody's going to turn up, drop their anchor loudly, and then throw a cast net over the bait, disperse the bait, and scare all the fish. Once they've got their live well full of bait, they're going to take off and find somewhere else to fish, right? It's one of the great ironies of live baiting in far north Queensland is you're allowed to use a cast net, so you're allowed to spook every fish in the prime feeding habitat. Those mangrove jack are there because the bait are there. Someone comes and throws a cast net, the bait are gone, the mangrove jack go into hiding, and then they go off somewhere else to fish. Doesn't make a lot of sense. But anyway, if I can get to this snag first, get a couple of casts in, I'll nearly always get a jack, and then I can go off and find some other parts of the creek system to fish once the cast netters have turned up. Now, the other thing I do, and as I said, I can be on the water at Trinity Inlet within 15 minutes of leaving home. So I have that kind of luxury, which, as I said, most Cairns people have. But I can pick those times when there's not going to be a lot of other boats on the water because it's windy, because it's rainy, because whatever reason, it's a weekday. I can pick those times where the waterways are going to be quiet and I can get out there. At perfect tides, I only need to be on the water for an hour to 2 hours. It doesn't have to be a whole day. And that means that I can pick the quiet times, pick the perfect opportunity, the prime times in terms of tides and that sort of thing. Go out there, put in a couple of hours, come back home again. So timing is everything. Tides are very important, obviously. In far north Queensland, we've got about a 3-metre tidal range in Cairns. Not as big as some other areas, but certainly enough that certain parts of the inlet fish well on certain tides, and you need to know where to go and when. But also you'll know that the water clarity is affected by tides. And this is another thing that comes into play. And I guess this comes back to stealth a little bit as well. Sometimes we'll get those periods, particularly after we've had some neapish tides, small tidal movement. And so the sediment tends to drop out of the water and it clears up, and we might get a little bit of incoming tide bringing clean water in as well. Now the fish, when the water's clear, are more vulnerable and they tend to be a little bit more on alert. If there's a little bit of murkiness about the water, if there's been some rain, some bigger tides to cloud it up, a bit of debris floating on the surface, then in a heavily pressured system, that gives you a little bit of an advantage because it makes it harder for the fish to see you, but also the fish are feeling less threatened. They're feeling a little bit emboldened by the ability to hide in dirty water, and so they tend to feed just a little bit more freely as well. So I don't like, chocolatey, muddy water, although it can fish okay. What I do like is a little bit of colour to the water, a little bit of greenish tinge, a little bit of brownish tinge, so that the water's not perfectly clear, but the fish are definitely on the prowl. And that aids with stealthy presentation, but it also comes down a little bit to timing and understanding how your waterways respond to tides and rain and other factors. The fourth tip that I've got for you is to be persistent. And I understand that might sound a little bit trite and a bit, whatever. But persistence is so important in hard fished waters because in less fished waters, you can throw just about anything at a fish. Mangrove jack, when they're on the chew in waters that don't see a lot of pressure, it really almost doesn't matter what lure you throw at them at times, they're going to hit it. That's not the case in waters where they see a lot of lures. It's not the case in waters where they're exposed to a lot of commotion, so they're a little bit more gun shy. Now, my fellow jackfishers, as well as barra fishers, Murray cod guys, jewfish guys, well, these are all fish for 1,000 casts, right? These are all fish you need to put in a lot of casts in order to get a few fish. And so experienced anglers that target those species understand what persistence is all about. Just keep going, keep trying, don't give up. But also keep experimenting. Don't keep throwing the same lure. Don't keep working it the same way. Don't keep fishing the same types of places, the same depths. And stay alert. Keep an eye on your sounder. Look for signs of fish. Look for signs of bait. Look for pressure points. Treat every cast as though it's going to be the next fish that you catch. Because it's very easy to fall into this kind of rhythmic cast, retrieve, cast, retrieve, cast, retrieve sort of a pattern, which is no doubt very therapeutic and quite relaxing, but it's not necessarily the best way to put fish on the bank or in the boat. So much as it might be discouraging to have not seen a fish for a while or not had a bite, particularly if you've had a donut trip the trip before or a couple of trips before, it's really important to stay focused, stay positive, keep casting, keep trying new things, because sooner or later you're going to crack that code. Or if you're not persistent, you're going to pack up and go home. You can't catch fish sitting on the couch. You've got to be out on the water. So be persistent, keep putting in casts, keep trying, even though you may not have immediate success, but keep thinking and keep adapting your approach. Now, my final tip for success on hard fished waters is to master the art of using soft plastic lures. And at this point, I'm going to unashamedly plug my soft plastic lures boot camp that's coming out shortly. For those who want to improve their fishing with soft plastic lures, you want to go and check that out at doclures.com/bootcamp. Now, like anything in fishing, this isn't a hard and fast rule. Obviously, I wouldn't be throwing soft plastics at tailor, for example, because they're going to get chewed up too quickly. Or I might prefer to use a crab or something like that for brim. But as a general rule, if you know and understand how to fish with soft plastic lures really effectively, they can be a very, very powerful tool for fishing hard fished waters because they're incredibly versatile and they can be presented very subtly. So let me go back to the conversation that I started today's episode with the gentleman at Trinity Inlet. When I talked to him, he was telling me that he loves fishing for mangrove jack using hard-bodied lures, which is great. So do I. And I've caught plenty of jacks in Trinity Inlet on hard-bodied lures, and one of the reasons I like using hard bodies is because you get an increased bycatch of barramundi in particular areas if you're using hard bodies. But I do the majority of my mangrove jack fishing in Trinity Inlet using soft plastic lures. And the reason for that is that I can do some things with soft plastics that I cannot do with a hard-bodied lure. And I think if this gentleman was able to put his passion and his enthusiasm for hard-bodied lures aside for a little bit and fish soft plastics, he'd understand just how much of a difference that can make in a system like Trinity Inlet. So on the day in question, we'd got 3 or 4 jacks between the two of us in a 3 or 4 hour session. So like I said, not a red hot day, but enough to keep us interested. And we probably could have got more fish, except we were fishing topwater lures. We wanted to fish on the surface. If we'd weighted lures, got them down a bit deeper, we might have picked up more fish. I don't know, maybe not. Perhaps we wouldn't. But what we were able to do, because we were fishing with soft plastic lures and we'd rigged them weedless, is we were able to skip cast those lures way down deep into the mangroves. In fact, in places where there were mangrove branches and great curtains of the kind of aerial root systems that some of the mangrove species have, that you couldn't possibly have got a hard-bodied lure in there. They don't skip. You wouldn't cast them into those aerial root systems because you'd snag up every time. Now, granted, we did snag up a few times. We lost a few lures. Even rigging them weedless, every now and then one's going to tie itself in a knot around a rhizome or something like that and not be easy to remove, especially if it's way down the back of a mangrove system. But all of our fish came from under deep cover where there's no way I could personally have got a hard-bodied lure. Maybe somebody who's better than me could. I couldn't get a hard-bodied lure there if I tried. But there's a couple other things as well about soft plastics. I mentioned a second ago that they could be fished very subtly. What I find in systems like Trinity Inlet, where there's a lot of boats coming through and where fish see a lot of lures, is they tend to hang very, very close to structure. So you don't have the luxury of being able to cast past the fish and bring the lure back, which you need to do with a hard-bodied lure. It needs a few turns of the handle to start working properly, right? Not only that, but a lot of hard-bodied lures have inbuilt rattles, or they're hollow plastic lures, so they make quite a noise when they hit the water surface, whereas a soft plastic lure can be landed very subtly. You can either just lift the rod tip at the end of the cast and land it very gently, or you can skip it into the mangrove roots so that it's actually on the mud or on the roots, and then just twitch it back into the water so it actually enters the water without making any noise at all. Now, a fish that's kind of already a little bit on alert, if something lands and splashes on top of it, it's likely to be spooked. Whereas if something swims past it, there's a chance it might get eaten, whether it's out of hunger or whether it's a reaction to being surprised by something coming into its territory. Now, we didn't fish them on that particular day, but there are other areas where the water's a bit deeper. It might be 1 metre or 1.5 metres straight down from the mangrove edges. And again, a hard-bodied lure, if you land it within 2 inches, let's say, of the mangrove roots, and it takes 2 or 3 turns of the reel handle to get that lure down to depth and working, it's already 1 metre away from the mangroves, which is too far to get a bite. Cast a weighted soft plastic in there, you can sink it all the way down the face of those mangrove roots where it might get eaten on the way down, and then you can work along the bottom, but you're starting with that lure working right in the zone and right in the fish's face, which makes all the difference. So I've gone back to my backyard example here, but you can find similar examples when you're fishing for bass. You can find similar examples fishing for brim, jewfish, you name it. And soft plastic lures are incredibly versatile for all of those species. And don't get me wrong, I'm not hitting any waterway that's got jacks or barra in it without a box of hard bodies, without a couple of stick baits, some poppers, a few soft vibes and so on. But definitely in harder fished waters, more often than not, I'm going to be fishing with the plastics unless the situation dictates that I fish with something else. And once again, in those hard fished, heavily pressured systems, I see a lot of people fishing with plastics, but they're all doing the same thing. They're all using the same lures, rigged in the same ways, working them in the same ways, and often not in the most appropriate way for the circumstances that they're fishing in. So a soft plastic lure is only versatile and deadly across a range of species and situations if you know the various different ways to fish it. And so, for example, I was sitting down the other day figuring out how to rig soft plastic prawns, and I realised that there's probably about 4 or 5 ways that I rig them on a regular basis. And then there's another 10 or 15 ways that I rig them from time to time because it's useful to be able to do so. Now, most of the time, those basic rigging techniques will catch fish, but when things are tough, that's when I turn to some of the more advanced techniques. And when you're fishing on heavily pressured waters, things are tough more often than when you're fishing on pristine, uncharted waters. So there you go. There's 5 tips for improving your catch rate on heavily fished waters. So size down your leaders, go as light as you can, go light to get the bite, as the saying goes, understanding that you may risk losing a bigger fish if something comes along and grabs your lure that you weren't expecting. That may be the price you pay for getting a bite. But I guess if you don't get a bite at all, you've got no chance. So sizing down your leaders is never a bad thing to do. Go stealthy, keep your electric motor noise low, move along at minimum speed, spot lock the right way so it's not making too much noise. Use a plonk or a stakeout pole or whatever to hold position if it's appropriate to do so, and so on. Fish at the right times of day. So timing was the third thing. Fish times when there's less activity on the water. Fish times where you're giving yourself the best opportunity to pick a few fish up. The fourth one was persistence. Remember that you are fishing on hard fish waters. Remember that the skills that you develop by putting in the time on those waters, even though it may not be as productive in terms of the number of fish you catch, those skills are going to serve you well when you go on to other waters, because you'll be able to catch fish. As I say, if you can catch fish on hard fish waters, you can catch fish on any waters. But there is no substitute for time on the water, and in heavily pressured systems, you may need to put more time in to figure those systems out and figure out how to catch the fish that other people can't catch. And then finally, and perhaps most powerfully, leverage the use of soft plastic lures. They're versatile, they're subtle, they can be fished with stealth, or they can be fished noisily and attract attention as well, depending on how you need to do it. And if you want some help to pick up your soft plastic lure fishing game, check out my soft plastic lure boot camp at doclures.com/bootcamp. It's a 12-week program, an hour a week, where I take you through all of my strategies for fishing with soft plastic lures that have come from 25 years of doing it, but also from conversations with over 500 anglers on the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast that have given me lots of great tips, lots of great things to try and experiment with. So all of that is available in the Soft Plastic Lure Bootcamp. If you join up early and you get involved early, you get a $100 lure pack as well, lure and terminal tackle pack. Plus you get to access the live webinars where I present them live and you can interact with me and ask questions. People who come along later, the bootcamp will still be available. You'll get the replay version and the lures obviously won't be available, but go and check it out. doclures.com/bootcamp. We go through every style of soft plastic lure and show you how to use it for, it doesn't matter what species or what location, but anywhere you go, anything you fish for, there's a technique and a strategy there that will see you right. That URL one more time, doclures.com/bootcamp. Go and check it out now. It costs nothing to check it out, and I reckon you'll be glad that you did. That's it for today, folks. No more shameless plugs, no more tips on fishing hard-fished waters, but we will be back with a new episode of the podcast on Monday, so stay tuned for that, and I will see you then. Until then, stay safe, may the fish be with you, and I will see you on the water sometime.
Thanks for listening to the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. For free show notes, downloads, tools and resources, please visit our website on doclures.com or consider supporting the show by joining Team Doc Lures to receive exclusive members-only episodes, tools and resources. But for now, tight lines and may the fish be with you.